I thought I was losing my mind when the new HOA president appeared out of nowhere, demanding I remove my boat from my own property. She gave me a week to complete or else. This was the kind of drama I'd only ever heard about on Anna Drama Nest, yet here it was, unfolding right in front of me. But it wasn't just about the boat. Something deeper was going on, something I had been sensing for days. Like I was being watched and manipulated by someone who had no idea what kind of fight they were starting. This wasn't a petty neighborhood disagreement anymore. It was personal. What would you do if someone pushed you this far? I never imagined this day would come, but there she was telling me to get rid of my boat or face the consequences. The nerve. I'm Greg, 40 years old. And I never saw myself as the type to clash with an HOA. Yet here we were. After my Olympic rowing career ended with a devastating knee injury, this old racing shell on Millbrook Lake had become my anchor. It wasn't just a boat. It was the last tangible piece of the man I used to be. Every morning, I'd sit on my dock, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise shimmer across the water, finding a peace I couldn't get anywhere else. The neighbors knew me well enough to wave as they passed. Life was simple, quiet, to exactly what I needed after losing everything I'd worked toward since I was a kid. At first, I wasn't even sure why I kept the boat. Maybe some stubborn part of me refused to let go completely. Then one morning, everything shifted. I was sipping coffee on my dock, still in my pajamas, when I spotted her marching toward me like she owned the shoreline. Linda Harrison, the new HOA president. I'd seen her around for months, expensive pantsuits, constant phone calls about permits and zoning laws, an air of authority that came from always getting her way. But we had never spoken until that moment. From the look on her face, I knew this wasn't going to be neighborly. She had a predatory calm, like she'd been rehearsing this scene for weeks. She stopped at the edge of my dock, arms folded. "Mr. Gregg," she said, my name tasting bitter in her mouth, "you have 7 days to remove that rusty eyesore." She gestured toward my boat with open disdain, like it was trash polluting her perfect view. "If you don't, we'll take action and you won't like the outcome." I stared at her, stunned. This boat had carried me to 2 Olympic finals, been featured in Sports Illustrated, and endured years of grueling training alongside me. Sure, it wasn't shiny Anna Maria, its paint faded, its hull scuffed, but calling it garbage felt like a slap in the face. I tried to stay calm. "What legal right do you have to demand I move my boat from my own property?" Linda pulled a folder from her bag, thick with official-looking documents. "This community improvement rule was passed at our recent HOA meeting," she said with a satisfied smirk. "Boats must meet aesthetic standards or be removed from common areas." Common areas? My dock was part of my property. I'd been paying taxes on it for years, maintaining it at my own expense. "When exactly was this meeting?" I asked, because I'd received no notice. Her smile turned sharp. "Oh, your notice?" she said with mock innocence. "Sometimes mail just disappears. The postal service can be so unreliable." The way she said it, her pause, her knowing glance sent a chill through me. This wasn't an accident. This was planned. I demanded to see the meeting minutes, the vote tally, everything. She laughed. "Greg, you're being far too combative about a simple community initiative. We're only trying to maintain property values." Her words were sweet, but her eyes were cold steel. This wasn't about property values, and she knew it. Linda stepped closer, the click of her heels like a countdown. Her perfume mingled with the crisp lake air. 7 days, she repeated, savoring the words. "After that, we'll consider it abandoned property and dispose of it ourselves." The threat hung in the air like smoke. She turned, heels striking the dock like she was staking her claim, then glanced back with a look I couldn't quite read, part triumph, part calculation. "I hope you make the smart choice. Fighting this would be broken bar unfortunate." Then she walked away, leaving me standing there with my coffee going cold and my hands trembling. I sat on the dock for the rest of the morning, staring at the boat that had carried so much of my life, trying to make sense of how it had come to this. The HOA president wanted to label my boat as junk and have it carted away like it was nothing more than yesterday's trash. But the insults to my career wasn't what bothered me the most. It was the way Linda operated. The so-called meeting, the mysteriously lost notice, the sharp precision in her threats, the way she had every piece of paper ready as if she'd been rehearsing this confrontation for weeks. I'd faced competitive people before. My entire athletic life had been a battle against them. But these a broken bar. This wasn't normal competition. This felt personal, like there was something much bigger at stake than one old racing shell tied to a dock. Should I just let it go? Absolutely not. The fight had already found me. After her initial threat, Linda completely switched tactics. No more showing up in person. Instead, she launched what I can only describe as a relentless phone harassment campaign. The first call came early in the morning, yanking me out of the first real sleep I'd had since our dockside clash. "Greg, I'm trying to be reasonable here," she snapped, her voice slicing through my grogginess like a knife. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Half awake, fumbling for my coffee maker, I barely had time to process her words before the calls started coming one after another all day. Each one sharper, more demanding, more threatening. By nightfall, the politeness was gone. Her voice was now pure command, each sentence a pressure point. I'd had enough. I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I waited for a break in her call barrage, then rang her back. Calmly, I told her I wanted to see the minutes and vote records from the home meeting she kept referring to. There was a long pause, so long I thought she'd hung up. I checked my phone, still connected. Then she laughed, not the smug, confident laugh from our first meeting, but one that sounded almost nervous. "You're being unnecessarily difficult, Mr. Gregg," she finally replied, her tone tight despite her attempt at professionalism. "This community values cooperation over confrontation." Cooperation over confrontation? I nearly laughed. This was coming from someone who'd spent days bombarding me with threats over the phone. I kept my voice steady and told her that requesting official records wasn't confrontational. It was standard procedure for any homeowner. Her next comment caught me completely off guard. "Greg, I think your athletic background might have left you with certain competitive tendencies that don't work well in a community setting. Sometimes, people need to learn when to step back and let others handle things." The way she said athletic background, like it was some sort of flaw, made my jaw tighten. And worse, the suggestion that wanting transparency made me a problem neighbor was infuriating. Later that day, my neighbor, Mr. Zar Patterson, pulled me aside. His face carried a worried look I'd never seen before. He lived next to me since I was a kid, cheered me on when I made the Olympic team, brought over casseroles when my parents moved away. If he was concerned, it was serious. "Greg," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be listening, "that meeting Linda mentioned, it never happened. She told us all it was an emergency vote. But I never got any official documentation and no agenda, no minutes, nothing legitimate." My pulse quickened. It was exactly what I'd suspected, but part of me had still hoped I was wrong. Linda had made it all up, fabricated the meeting, lied to my face, and backed it up with false paperwork. The next time she called, I confronted her with what Mr. Patterson had told me. She didn't deny it. She didn't even bother making an excuse. Instead, she shifted gears instantly, as if she'd prepared for this exact moment. "Greg, let me be very clear," she said, and I heard the rustle of papers in the background. "I'm sending you final documentation today. You have 4 days left." Her voice was cold, businesslike, eerily rehearsed, like she'd delivered this line to other people before me. An hour later, a courier arrived with an official-looking envelope. Inside was a letter stamped "Final Notice, a violation of community standards." It demanded immediate removal of my boat or face legal consequences. The letterhead was polished, the language intimidating, but something about it didn't feel right. Real legal notices usually came through certified mail, stamped with official seals. This didn't have that same weight. Something about it felt off, like I was missing the bigger picture of Linda's motives. Why would she go to such elaborate, costly lengths to remove one old boat. The scale of her efforts was too coordinated, too deliberate for someone who just didn't like the view from her kitchen window. That night, instead of reacting to her latest move, I decided to start digging. I went online, pulling up every public record, business filing, permit application, anything tied to Linda Harrison and her development company. What I found made the puzzle snap into focus in a way that was equal parts satisfying and chilling. 3 months ago, around the time Linda moved into our neighborhood, a Harrison development had filed paperwork for a luxury lakefront development project. The planned site, Millbrook Lake, more specifically, the stretch of shoreline that included my property and several neighboring lots. Suddenly, everything clicked. This had nothing to do with aesthetic standards or community improvements. This was about clearing the way for a profitable business venture. My boat, my dock, maybe even my entire home, were standing in the way. And Linda was willing to fabricate meetings, forge paperwork, and harass me into submission to get what she wanted. Oddly enough, part of me felt relieved because now I knew exactly what I was fighting. But that relief came with the realization that I was up against something far more dangerous than a power-hungry HOA president. She had serious financial stakes in removing me, and she'd already proven she wasn't afraid to play dirty. Still, there was something about her that felt a broken bar unfinished, like she was hiding something from her own past. The thought made me consider my own family's history. Maybe there was something there that could help me fight back. The next morning, I found myself in the garage, staring at my grandfather's old trunk. I hadn't opened it since my parents moved to Florida. I didn't know why I thought of it. Maybe desperation. Maybe instinct. The trunk was heavier than I remembered. I hesitated, then lifted the lid. A rush of musty air and the faint scent of old leather spilled out, carrying decades of forgotten history. Beneath stacks of yellowed photographs and my grandmother's jewelry box, I spotted a manila folder stuffed with documents. Some were so fragile they seemed to wilt in my hands. One brittle sheet caught my eye, its faded ink and ornate seals dated 1878. My fingers shook as I read the title, which appeared to reference Millbrook Lake and land ownership rights. The handwriting was the kind of elaborate script that looked beautiful but was nearly impossible to read, and the legal terms were foreign to me. I spent close to 20 minutes just trying to decipher one paragraph. Did it say perpetual ownership? Or was I imagining it? Was this a genuine historical document, a broken bar, or just a family keepsake my grandfather picked up at some antique shop? I'd heard too many stories about valuable heirlooms that turned out to be worthless reproductions. The more I studied the paper, the more uncertain I became. I spent hours researching land records from the late 1800s, but the online archives were inconsistent and full of gaps. The local historical society's site mentioned the early development of Millbrook Lake but offered no reference to my family name. Every search led me down a new rabbit hole, only to dead end in more questions. Maybe I was just chasing a fantasia, clinging to some myth instead of focusing on practical ways to stop Linda. But deep down, something told me this piece of paper mattered. My gut insisted it was important, even as my logical mind warned me I might just be wasting precious time. It turned out Linda had shifted gears again. She'd moved from relentless phone calls to a quieter, but somehow more unsettling, form of psychological warfare. Instead of direct threats, she started posting on our neighborhood's private message board harmless-looking notes that were clearly aimed at me. It's disappointing when certain residents think they're above community standards that benefit everyone, she wrote, followed by a long lecture on property maintenance and neighborly respect. She never mentioned my name, but there was no doubt who she meant. The comments started racking up likes from people I didn't recognize. That made me wonder, were these real neighbors, or fake profiles she created to boost her narrative? It felt like high school gossip all over again, except I was 40, and my bully was the HOA president. The only glimmer of kindness came from an unexpected knock on my door that evening. Mrs. Taylor, my elderly neighbor from 3 houses down, stood there holding a plate of homemade cookies and wearing the kind of concerned expression that can melt walls. Mrs. Taylor has lived here for decades. She remembers everyone's history, still brings casseroles when someone's sick, and somehow knows all the kids' names. She set the cookies on my counter and took a seat at my kitchen table. Greg, she began, your grandfather once told me your family had a special connection to this lake. He was very proud of that. Always talked about how your great-grandfather helped develop this area back in the day. Her words lit a spark in me. Maybe I wasn't completely delusional for thinking that old document I'd found could be real. She didn't have the fine details, so it had been years since she'd heard the story, but her certainty about my family's history made me feel less like I was chasing shadows. Even so, my mind wouldn't stop circling the same problem. Even if the paper was authentic, what could I do with it? March into court and hope a judge would side with me over century-old land rights? Throw it in front of Linda as evidence I could barely understand myself? The practical side of me said this was just wishful thinking, or that I should accept reality and find a way to work with Linda rather than fight her over what might just be a piece of decorative family memorabilia. But every time I looked at those faded signatures and official seals, something inside me whispered that it mattered. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it really was the key to everything. I didn't know if I was chasing the truth or chasing ghosts. But I knew one thing: I wasn't ready to give up. The next morning, I called Tom Rodriguez, a property attorney recommended to me when I bought the house. He'd always been reliable. But this time, when we met, his expression was more serious than I'd ever seen. This could take years, he said, studying the paper through a magnifying glass like it was an ancient relic. If this ownership document proves authentic, it could be huge for your situation. But legal verification could take months or maybe a year and cost thousands in fees. And there's no guarantee it would hold up in court. The words hit me hard. Tom, I don't have months. Linda's breathing down my neck with a deadline, and she's not interested in waiting for the legal process. He leaned back, shaking his head like a doctor about to deliver bad news. Greg, I get the urgency, but the legal system doesn't move at HOA speed. If we rush this, we could actually weaken your case. Then he explained what authenticating would mean: a carbon dating, handwriting analysis, expert witnesses. The process was slow, expensive, and suffocating. Meanwhile, Linda was already acting like she had one hand on the win. For the first time, I wondered if I should just move the boat and end the fight. I thought about simply giving up, moving the boat and finding another quiet place to store my memories, somewhere they wouldn't stir up so much trouble. Tom's gaze sharpened as he scanned the document. If this is genuine, it changes everything. But if it's not a broken bar, his voice faded, and for the first time, I felt my certainty crack. Greg, this isn't only about your property or your boat, he continued. According to this, if it's legitimate, your great-grandfather kept legal ownership of the entire lake when he donated the surrounding land to the township back in 1878. He pointed to a section of the deed I'd overlooked, dense legal wording that described water rights and shoreline boundaries. If the document held up, it meant the lake itself and 30 feet of shoreline around its entire edge still belonged to my family. Linda's building projects, her HOA authority, even township permits wouldn't matter. I stared at him, stunned. This felt bigger than winning the lottery, and far messier. If it was true, Linda hadn't just been overstepping, as she'd been threatening me over land that might already be mine, making her the trespasser. I've shared dramatic experiences on Anna Drama Nest before, but living one myself was an entirely different storm. My hands trembled as I left Tom's office, my mind spinning with the implications. What would you do if you suddenly learned you might own something powerful people were trying to take from you? The logical choice was to stay quiet until Tom confirmed everything. But with Linda's deadline looming, caution felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. That same evening, Linda called an emergency HOA meeting at the community center, giving just 1 day's notice. When I walked in, she was already stationed at the front with a laptop, projector, and glossy handouts that screamed professional campaign. Her presentation was all about a community beautification initiative, complete with colorful charts on property values, neighborhood reputation, and maintaining standards to attract quality residents. She repeatedly mentioned removing eyesores and non-conforming elements, locking eyes with me each time. It was a sales pitch aimed at turning the neighborhood against me, painting me as the selfish holdout standing in the way of collective progress. Some of the newer residents nodded and asked about timelines. Long-term neighbors stayed silent, shifting uncomfortably. Then Mrs. Patterson, one of the longest-standing residents who was never one to bite her tongue, raised her hand. Linda, didn't Harrison Development have their lakefront permits denied by the county last year? Funny how you became HOA president right after that rejection, and now you're pushing standards that would clear the way for that same project. The room went dead quiet. Linda's mask slipped just enough to show the anger underneath. That's irrelevant to tonight's discussion, she snapped, her tone sharpened now. This meeting is about community standards, not my business dealings. But her reaction told everyone what they needed to know. I caught the exchange of knowing glances around the room. The meeting ended without a vote, but I noticed several residents quietly approaching Mrs. Patterson afterward, asking about the permits and Linda's motives. A few even came to me, apologizing for not speaking up sooner. Mr. Johnson, from 2 streets over, said he'd been pressured to alter his workshop because Linda called it inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. It was becoming obvious I wasn't her only target, just the most visible one because of the lake issue. Walking home, I sensed momentum shifting in my favor. But I also knew Linda wouldn't back down. She'd double her efforts now that her mask had slipped. I used to tell stories like this on Anna Drama Nest, watching other people endure impossible situations and imagining what I'd do. Now I was living near and I wasn't sure I had the courage or legal ground to pull the trigger. Then Tom's voice echoed in my head from earlier, low and urgent, "You're not going to believe these a broken bar." After that disastrous home meeting, Linda completely dropped her polite phi tilde section 8. What followed was unlike anything I'd faced in my adult life, a relentless, calculated character assassination campaign. It was strategic, malicious, and showed me just how deep her resources went and how little regard she had for basic decency. Out of nowhere, my name started appearing on neighborhood review sites I didn't even know existed, each one painting me as antisocial, unstable, even dangerous. Anonymous complaints poured into township offices, accusing me of reckless boating that endangered children. Whispers floated around local businesses about me supposedly struggling with mental instability after a sports injury. Each claim was like a small blade, vague but sharp enough to wound. Piece by piece, my image was being chipped away until the man I actually was became almost unrecognizable. Reading those things felt surreal, like I'd stepped into some distorted alternate universe where I was a community menace instead of someone just trying to keep his boat at his own dock. Linda wasn't stopping at gossip. She was methodically building a narrative that painted me as unpredictable and unsafe, clearly setting the stage to discredit me if this ever ended up in court or before township officials. Concerned neighbors repeated her exact words to me: "Greg has emotional issues from when his athletic career ended, and community safety is at risk with his erratic behavior on the lake." The psychological weight of it all was suffocating. I found myself second-guessing every interaction, wondering who believed her and who saw through the phi tilde section 8. Sleep became impossible. At my lowest point, I even started to wonder if she was right. Maybe fighting this was a fool's errand. She had money, influence, PR skills, and absolutely no hesitation about weaponizing them. I had a broken bar, an old boat, a questionable document, and a lawyer who had already warned me about the financial and emotional toll of a legal battle. If I looked at it logically, she held every advantage. It would have been easy to convince myself I was being stubborn over something trivial, that maybe I should just move the boat and avoid the harassment altogether. But Linda was playing for keeps, using every dirty tactic she could muster. That night, staring at my boat under the moonlight, I realized that some things are worth risking everything for, even if you're not sure you can win. Just as I was teetering on the edge of giving up, Help arrived from an unexpected source. Outside the grocery store, I ran into retired County Clerk Elizabeth Morris, a quiet, observant woman in her 70s who, despite her reserved demeanor, had eyes that missed nothing. "Young man," she began, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent decades handling legal matters, "I heard about your situation with that development woman. 50 years ago, I personally processed the paperwork when your grandfather donated land to this township for public use." She leaned closer. "There's something in those original agreements that Linda doesn't know, something that could change everything about her plans." Elizabeth's words were the connection I had been searching for, the missing link between my family's old document and today's legal standing. She told me about the township meeting back in 1923, the official records she'd archived herself, and a specific clause that kept lake ownership in my family forever. "Your great-grandfather was very deliberate about that condition," she said, pulling a small, worn notebook from her purse, filled with notes she'd clearly been keeping for decades. Elizabeth explained that my great-grandfather had been very clear in his intentions. He wanted the community to enjoy the land, but he never wanted the lake itself turned into a commercial venture. That's why he had kept ownership of the water and shoreline within the family, a safeguard against exactly what Linda was attempting now. She told me the original paperwork still sat in the county archives, properly filed and legally valid. That meant Linda's permits were flawed from the very beginning because she never had legal rights to the lake access in the first place. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. Elizabeth not only gave me the crucial information, but also promised to help me retrieve those documents. And just as I started to regain my footing, Linda made her boldest, most desperate move yet. That Saturday morning, the rumble of trucks outside jolted me. Looking out my window, I saw her standing at my dock, heels clicking sharply as she motioned for a commercial towing crew to take my boat. A small group of neighbors gathered, watching as she announced into her phone, probably for record-keeping, that this was the emergency removal of abandoned property. She was trying to take my boat in broad daylight, banking on the idea that she could finish before I could stop her. My grip tightened on the documents I carried as I walked straight toward her and the tow truck driver. The driver looked uneasy. "Sir, I don't want any trouble," he said, glancing between us. "I'm just here for the job, but if there's a dispute about ownership, I'm not touching anything until it's settled legally." Linda's smirk faltered, shifting into anger. She barked at him to proceed. But I now had undeniable proof, paperwork showing that my family owned both the dock and the lake. With steady steps, I handed the driver photocopies of the documents along with Elizabeth's official confirmation. He studied them, then shook his head. "Ma'am, I'm not moving private property without proper legal clearance. I'm not risking a lawsuit over this." It was the first crack in Linda's carefully crafted authority, and the watching neighbors seemed to sense it. More people stepped out of their homes, drawn by her increasingly loud, desperate shouting. I turned to the growing crowd, my voice steady in a way it hadn't been for weeks. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet the actual owner of Millbrook Lake. Not the HOA, not the township, not Linda's company, me. My family has held legal title to this lake for nearly a century and a half, and I have the documents to prove it." I held up the archival records and my great-grandfather's original deed. The mood shifted instantly. Neighbors leaned in, listening. Linda's face drained of color before flushing red as she realized I wasn't bluffing. Her morning of confidence had just collapsed in front of the whole neighborhood. Linda's carefully built Phi Tilde Section 8 was about to shatter in front of the very people whose opinions mattered most. Her voice trembled as she tried to counter my words, the polished control she usually carried giving way to raw desperation. "This is absurd," she snapped. "Greg forged those papers. He's trying to trick all of you." Before I could respond, Elizabeth Morris stepped out from the crowd. Her presence instantly shifted the energy of the confrontation. Everyone here knew her, decades of community service, a reputation for fairness, and a history of meticulous honesty. "Linda," she said with the calm authority of someone who had spent half a century safeguarding official records. "I personally handled these filings in 1923 when I was a junior clerk at the county office. If you'd like, I can call the county clerk's office right now. I still have contacts there who can bring the original files within the hour." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and Linda's silence told everyone exactly where the truth lay. Just then, Tom Rodriguez arrived with a sheriff's deputy. The officer studied the documents carefully, cross-checking Elizabeth's copies against a database on his phone, making calls to confirm details, treating this as a legitimate legal matter rather than some petty neighborhood feud. At last, he turned to Linda. "Ma'am, these documents appear valid. If they are, your development permits will be suspended immediately pending a full investigation. You could be facing fraud charges for attempting to develop property you don't own." It was the first time I'd ever seen Linda look truly defeated. The empire she had built on intimidation and bluff was disintegrating in front of a neighborhood crowd that was finally seeing her tactics for what they were. The deputy's radio crackled with his report, and the sound felt like the final blow to her reign. This was no longer just about my boat. This was the unraveling of her entire grip on the community. The spectators, who had been silently watching as though this was some twisted lived drama, suddenly became active participants in her fall. Mr. Patterson called for an immediate vote to remove Linda as HOA president. Before she could object or hide behind procedure, hands shot into the air. "All in favor of removing Linda Harrison from HOA leadership effective immediately?" More than 20 hands went up. Only 2 people abstained. Not a single one supported her. Mrs. Patterson was elected interim president on the spot, and her very first act was to address me publicly. "Greg, this community owes you a sincere apology for letting this drag on for so long. We should have stood by you from the start." Mrs. Patterson went on to say they should have questioned Linda's motives from the start instead of letting her bully everyone with fabricated authority and manufactured emergencies. The crowd actually applauded, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was surrounded by neighbors, not adversaries. Once the truth was out, the legal fallout came fast. Within 2 hours, township officials arrived to announce that Harrison Development would be investigated for taking government grants meant for public lakefront improvements, grants they had used on land that was privately owned. That meant possible federal fraud charges. Linda's permits were pulled on the spot. Her company's assets were frozen, and she was staring down both civil and criminal consequences for trying to develop land she never owned in the first place. The woman who had spent weeks threatening me with lawsuits was now facing the possibility of a federal trial. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching her squirm. I stood there as she stammered to township officials, while neighbors shook their heads in disgust. In that moment, I understood something. Justice can take time, but when it arrives, it's worth every second of the wait. When the tow truck driver walked away from my boat and Linda realized her entire plan had collapsed, I knew the fight was over. But watching her face as her power crumbled, I also knew her punishment was just beginning. Within a week, her empire collapsed completely. Harrison Development filed for bankruptcy. Investors abandoned her without hesitation. The local newspaper splashed the story across its front page, and regional outlets quickly picked it up, drawn to the David versus Goliath angle, a family's century-old lake deed defeating corporate greed. One headline read, "HOA President's Illegal Scheme Exposed." Linda's name was dragged through print and online media alike. Federal prosecutors announced charges for misusing improvement grants on private property, and the IRS launched a tax audit. 3 other HOA communities came forward, alleging she had used the same intimidation tactics elsewhere. Even before a verdict, her legal defense bills alone were enough to bankrupt her. Watching her scramble for attorneys willing to represent her while her accounts were frozen was almost surreal and, if I'm honest, a little satisfying. Every new revelation triggered another investigation. Civil suits piled up, harassment, abuse of HOA power, attempted theft of private property. The county district attorney filed fraud charges. The state attorney general launched a broader investigation into her developments. The federal charges carried the possibility of prison time. Her name became toxic in the real estate industry. Former partners publicly distanced themselves, and trade publications warned about the dangers of aggressive development tactics, always with Linda as the cautionary tale. Every news story mentioned her failed attempt to take a former Olympian's boat, making her look both petty and criminal. The change in our neighborhood was immediate and uplifting, like someone had pulled away a heavy curtain we didn't even realize was blocking the sunlight. The new HOA leadership organized Greg Harrison Family Heritage Day at the lakefront, a celebration of my family's century-long contributions and the historical protections around our lake. Local media covered the event as a victory over corporate overreach. Elderly neighbors shared memories of my grandfather, and old photographs surfaced, including images of him meeting township leaders in the 1920s, a proof of the legacy Elizabeth had described. The day felt like a collective healing, the first time in years our community came together around something good rather than fear or division. Property values rose, thanks to the positive publicity. The State Tourism Board designated Millbrook Lake as a historic site, attracting visitors who wanted to see the lake that beat corporate greed. Shops began selling T-shirts and postcards celebrating the victory. Tour boats added a stop at my dock, where guides told the story of the century-old deed that stopped a modern land grab. Ironically, Linda's attempt to harm property values had made the neighborhood more valuable and historically important than ever. Facing financial ruin, lawsuits, criminal charges, and total social isolation, Linda put her house up for sale. Neighbors saw moving trucks in the middle of the night as she was trying to leave quietly, without facing the people she had wronged. The house sat on the market for months, unwanted by buyers wary of its infamous history, until she sold it far below market value. Last anyone heard, she had moved to another state, trying to outrun the fallout she had created. Even after she left town, Linda couldn't escape the legal fallout. Federal charges don't vanish just because you cross a state line. The woman who once vowed to ruin my peaceful life through legal threats was ultimately undone by those very same laws. To reclaim the place she had tried to tarnish, I organized the first ever rowing competition on the lake that had been my battleground. It wasn't just a sporting event, it was our celebration, our healing moment. The race quickly became an annual tradition, drawing families together and mending the rifts Linda had created with her schemes and intimidation. Children now learned to row in the same waters where my great-grandfather had struck the original agreements to protect the lake, carrying forward a legacy Linda had tried so hard to erase for her own profit. Seeing kids laughing and splashing while parents cheered from the shore, I knew this was exactly what he had envisioned, a lake kept in family hands, shielded from greedy development and commercialization. What Linda intended as a divisive, profit-driven takeover ended up uniting the community. People learned the importance of their local history, recognized the value of preservation, and understood how vital it is not to be manipulated by those seeking personal gain at everyone else's expense. The very lake Linda tried to take from me had become a symbol of resilience, proof that standing your ground is worth it, and no matter how long the fight. Mrs. Patterson even started a neighborhood watch to ensure no future HOA abuse could take root, and new residents received welcome packets detailing both their rights and the historical importance of our protected shoreline. On sunny afternoons, I'd see kids swimming where I once trained for the Olympics, families enjoying picnics, and neighbors smiling together. I knew then, some battles are worth every ounce of effort. Linda Harrison learned the hard truth: you can't take what doesn't belong to you, and you can't scare people off their land. In the end, the lake she tried to claim stood as a monument to community unity over greed. As she drove away in defeat, I stood by the water, certain my family's legacy was safe for generations to come. The takeaway: stand your ground, and the truth will always come out on top. What would you have done? Comment below. That's a wrap from Anna Drama Nest, but stick around, there's plenty more drama, twists, and unbelievable stories waiting for you on our channel.